Good morning and welcome. I'm Laura Padilla-Walker and I'm currently serving as the Dean of the College of Family, Home, and Social Sciences. We're so happy to welcome you to the annual Martin B. Hickman Lecture, presented by Julianne Holt-Lunstad. The Martin B. Hickman Outstanding Scholar Award is the most prestigious award that we present to a faculty researcher. Dr. Hickman was the dean of our college for 17 years, and after just about finishing my first year as dean, I'm starting to appreciate the length of his tenure a lot more. His contributions continue to bless the lives of our students in our college. But the Hickman Award is given each year to a distinguished faculty member whose professional contributions emulate excellence. As I mentioned, the 2021-2022 award recipient is Dr. Julianne Holt-Lunstad, Professor of Psychology and Neuroscience. Before Dr. Holt-Lunstad begins her lecture, we're first going to hear from Dr. Hickman's daughter, Patricia, about the man who this award is named after. And after her remarks, Dr. Wendy Birmingham, Associate Professor and Associate Chair of Psychology, will introduce Dr. Holt-Lunstad. Patricia, thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I am so grateful for the opportunity to represent our family at the beginning of the 29th Annual Hickman Lecture. My sister Melissa and I share an additional connection to this college since both of us received our bachelor's degree in this college. And I don't know if Melissa had the same experience, but I not only got my diploma, a handshake, but I got a hug from the dean as I walked across the stage at graduation. We'd like to extend our heartfelt thanks to Dean Walker and the faculty, staff, and students of the college for their dedication in not only honoring our father, but the faculty who receive this award and carry on a tradition of excellence, which has been part of this college from the very beginning. We'd like to extend our congratulations to Dr. Holt-Lunstad for receiving this award. Every lecture we have attended has stretched our thinking and enlightened our minds. In preparation for my remarks today, I took some time and perused the website for the college. It is remarkable to see how far the college has come from my father's time when it was just he and his administrative assistant on the second floor of the Mazer building. Just as an aside, he was the dean when this building was built, and he made sure that his office was situated so that he could see the football practice field using his binoculars. As a father to 6 daughters and a husband to a vibrant, independent, and forceful woman, and the first dean on campus to appoint a female associate dean, I know he would be pleased to see how many women are fulfilling positions of leadership in the administration, faculty, and staff of the college. Many years ago at a college dinner I was attending with my dad, Lou Midgley, who was a faculty member in the political science department and was known for never being afraid of speaking his mind, took me to task for not having read my father's book, Problems of American Foreign Policy. I must admit to some initial guilt for my failings, but as I have thought about it over the years, I have come to see that what my father left to each of us, whether family or faculty, staff, or students of the college, was greater than the words he could have written. To each of us, he left a love of learning, a commitment to excellence in his work, and a devotion to family, friends, and faith. These will stand all of us in good stead long after our time at BYU has come to a close. I'd like to share with you a passage from the Anthony Trollope book, The Warden, part of the Barchester Chronicles that our father left, and that he hoped would describe him at the end of his life. Quote, "The author now leaves him in the hands of his readers, not as a hero, not as a man to be admired and talked of, not as a man who should be toasted at public dinners and spoken of with conventional absurdity as a perfect divine, but as a good man without guile, believing humbly in the religion which he has striven to teach and guided by the precepts which he has striven to learn." We are so very grateful to all of you for the companionship you give to us in carrying forward his work and in honoring his name. Thank you.
Dr. Julianne Holt-Lunstad is a professor of psychology and neuroscience at Brigham Young University. She is the founding scientific chair of the U.S. Foundation for Social Connection and the Global Initiative on Loneliness and Connection. Dr. Holt-Lunstad's research is focused on understanding the long-term health effects, biological mechanisms, and effective strategies to mitigate risk and protection associated with social connection. Her work has been seminal in the recognition of social isolation and loneliness as risk factors for early mortality. She serves as a scientific advisor and consults regularly for organizations across sectors aimed at addressing this issue. She has provided expert testimony in a U.S. congressional hearing, provided expert recommendations for the U.S. Surgeon General Emotional Well-Being in America Initiative, and is currently a member of the technical working group for the UK Cross Developmental Loneliness Team. She's a member of the National Academy of Sciences Consensus Committee and a subject matter expert for the Gravity Project and Commit to Connect, the National Clearinghouse of Interventions. She also serves as a scientific advisor for the Australian Coalition to End Loneliness and the Research Advisory Panel for AARP Services, United Healthcare, and Rural Aging. She is currently advising the World Health Organization and the European Commission Joint Research Center. Her work has been widely recognized within her discipline, including several awards, and is regularly highlighted in media outlets. So we're so pleased to have Dr. Holt-Lunstad with us today, and I'll turn the time over to you.
Thank you so much. I feel like I need to start this talk by really offering my gratitude. First and foremost, the gratitude for receiving this award and to the Hickman family and for the legacy that has been left. I need to also express gratitude for the college. And that the work I'm going to be talking about today really couldn't have happened without the support of my colleagues, my collaborators, my students, and of course, the support of my family. I think it's only fitting that I honor those connections as I talk about the importance of our connections. But I think it's also incredibly important that we acknowledge that tomorrow marks the 2-year anniversary since the global pandemic, or since the World Health Organization declared a global pandemic. And in some ways, the past 2 years have been an incredible blur. I think little did any of us know just how profoundly we all would be affected by this, or for how long. And it's been incredibly easy to get fatigued and frustrated. To some extent, it's become easy to become desensitized as well. However, earlier in the fall, I had the opportunity to visit Washington, D.C. on my very first work trip since the pandemic began. And while I visited the National Mall, I was able to visit this memorial to all those who lost their lives to COVID. Each of the white flags represented here represents the death of someone's mother, father, sister, brother, friend. This was an incredibly powerful experience. Particularly as I watch the artist update that number, which of course increases daily. And of course that number is much larger now and closer to 1 million today. But as I walked the sea of white flags, I was overwhelmed by the sense of collective grief and loss. But I was also overwhelmed with the realization that these white flags just simply represented the official death toll, but did not represent the full scope of loss or the full scope of additional direct, indirect, and secondary effects of the pandemic. We have certainly lost so much more, and the costs are ongoing. Older adults have been hit particularly hard during the pandemic, not only disproportionately affected and represented in COVID-related deaths and hospitalizations, but also by the isolation measures that have been taken to protect older adults. And yet, we know that this isn't just an older adult issue. In fact, every single one of us have been affected. Each of us has had to significantly alter how we engage socially. And sadly, the term social distancing became part of our collective lexicon. Children's education changed. Remote work has become a norm, which has, of course, been particularly tough on working parents. Teens and college students have been, at a time when their lives should be, and their social lives should be expanding, instead have been profoundly disrupted. Social isolation is no longer something that occurs or is something that is just experienced by a few. And yet we have all experienced social isolation to some extent and on a global scale. So with these restrictions has come the important big question: what will these effects have on us? What do we know about the short-term and long-term effects of isolation and loneliness? What can we do to reduce the risk, and how might this have an impact long-term? And so, of course, we don't have all the answers yet, and nor do we know the full scope of the ramifications of this pandemic yet. But I've spent my career, and others in this field have spent decades researching some of this. So today I'm going to draw upon some of that evidence, as well as highlight some of the challenges in trying to answer some of these questions. But before I get into that evidence, it's important to set the stage and define some terms. And so these terms are related but distinct. So for instance, homebound refers to never or rarely leaving the home over the past month. Social isolation is objectively being alone, having few relationships or infrequent social contact. And loneliness is the subjective distressing of feeling alone, or the discrepancy between one's desired level of connection and one's actual level of connection. Now, of course, each of these represent social deficits, but they are distinct, and they can, while they can co-occur, not always. So for instance, someone might be alone but not feel lonely. And conversely, someone can still feel lonely amongst others. Conversely, social connection refers to an umbrella term that includes social assets that encompass the structure, function, and quality of one's relationships. Now, importantly, all of these have been linked to health and well-being. Now, I had the honor and privilege of serving on a National Academy of Science consensus committee that examined the medical and healthcare relevance of social isolation and loneliness. And after a thorough review of the scientific evidence, the committee found substantial evidence that social isolation and loneliness are associated with greater incidence of major psychological, cognitive, and physical morbidities, and lower perceived well-being and quality of life, with the strongest evidence associated with risk for mortality. This led the committee to conclude that social isolation is a major public health concern. Now, I want to note the date that this was published. This was published February 27th, 2020, just 2 weeks prior to the World Health Organization declaring a global pandemic. So we already had good evidence of the health effects of social isolation and loneliness prior to the pandemic. Of course, there were concerns about social isolation and loneliness long before the pandemic. In fact, some even referring to it as a loneliness epidemic. Here's a screenshot from 2018. As well as evidence suggesting that a high prevalence of the population was affected. So it's important to recognize that this is not a new issue, but rather there is increased urgency to address this issue. An important question becomes whether loneliness has actually increased as a result of the pandemic. And is there actual worsening of this problem? Or have people been able to remain relatively resilient? Now, there were actually a flurry of scientific studies that tried to examine this very question. Most of that evidence is cross-sectional retrospective surveys, so simply asking people at one point in time, do you feel lonelier now than you did before? Unfortunately, those are somewhat subject to bias, but there have been a number of longitudinal studies where they asked people, or already had data, surveying people on isolation and loneliness prior to the pandemic and were able to follow up at some point during the pandemic. And so there was a meta-analysis of 32 independent longitudinal studies, and this includes data from over 185,000 participants. And what this data shows is that there was an increase not only in the prevalence of loneliness, so more people felt lonely, but also an increase in the severity of that loneliness. And this was compared to prior to the pandemic. And so what this data suggests is that this problem has only gotten worse. But this is data that has shown significant relative changes. But yet we don't yet know what the exact prevalence rates are because we don't have standardized national measurement. In other words, there are multiple studies that are using varying measurement types, and so we're able to detect change, but it's harder to determine the precise overall prevalence. Now, this increase in loneliness and distress during the pandemic is perhaps not at all surprising to any of you. And this distress is due to, this is really a normal response. Humans are social beings. We aren't meant to be alone. Now, this is a picture I took of a water bottle that one of my students brought into my lab one day, and I loved it because it's so closely tied to the work that we're doing, and of course, carries so much more meaning now. But I asked the question, should we take this literally? Is human contact as fundamental to health as and survival as water? So several neuroscientists, including the late John Cacioppo, have argued that loneliness is our biology, signaling a need to reconnect socially. And so just like hunger signals a need and motivates us to seek out food, and thirst motivates us to seek out water, that loneliness is thought to be a biological drive that motivates us to reconnect socially. So do we literally crave social contact? Well, a study out of MIT found that 10 hours of isolation had a similar neurosignature as going 10 hours without food, suggesting that acute isolation causes social cravings similar to hunger. And this, of course, is consistent with other evidence that humans need other humans. Of course, humans are one of the most vulnerable species at birth. And throughout human history, we have needed to rely on others for survival. Early research shows that infants and children in custodial care that lack human contact fail to thrive and often die. But of course, there's evidence across disciplines that demonstrate the importance of social contact and human contact across the lifespan. And so this has led some scientists to argue that our brains have evolved to and adapted to expect social contact or social proximity. So for example, some work by Jim Cohen suggests that our brains use more metabolic resources when coping with threats when we are alone compared to when we are in the presence of others, particularly trusted others. And so this evidence suggests the biological manifestations of cues to maintain social ties. But of course, as we have faced a novel and deadly virus and its subsequent variants, it's clear that slowing the spread is paramount, with concerns around social isolation and loneliness as being secondary. So why should we care about social isolation and loneliness? So I want to share with you this quote. "Friendship is unnecessary, like philosophy and like art. It has no survival value. Rather, it's one of those things which gives value to survival." Now, I share this because I think it perfectly captures the general sentiment that our relationships are primarily what drives our quality of life. Yet the scientific evidence suggests that our relationships do have survival value. And social isolation and loneliness not only just impact our emotional well-being and even our mental health, but actually influence our survival and can be deadly. And this is not just limited to suicide or domestic violence. There's actually robust evidence of risk of death from all causes. So where does this evidence come from? This conclusion comes from decades of research, of epidemiological research, including some of my own. And so I sought to, in some of my work, I sought to determine the overall magnitude of this effect. And so after a thorough search of the relevant databases, my colleagues and I conducted a meta-analysis including 70 prospective studies. And so this data includes data from over 3.4 million participants, followed for an average of 7 years. And after controlling for multiple factors that might potentially also contribute to mortality, the analyses revealed that loneliness is associated with increased death by 26%, social isolation by 29%, and living alone by 32%. Conversely, an earlier meta-analysis that we did that included 148 studies examined the protective effects of being socially connected. And we found that social connection increases our odds of survival by 50%. And again, importantly, these accounted for age, initial health status, and a variety of factors, thereby establishing an independent predictor of risk for mortality. Importantly, there are now multiple meta-analyses that have replicated these findings. A recent review identified 276 independent studies that just looked at physical health outcomes alone. And there are several more studies that have been published even just within the last 6 months. So we have a robust body of evidence and can be quite confident in these findings. But just how serious is the threat? Of course, we have strong evidence of a variety of factors that influence our risk for premature mortality, some of them listed here. And as you can see, they vary in the extent to which they predict earlier death. Now, when we benchmark these social factors relative to these other factors that we take quite seriously, what we can see is that in many cases, these factors are comparable and in some cases actually exceed the risks associated with some of these other factors. Now, of course, some of these are inverse because some are protective while others are associated with risk, so that each represents the strength of effect on survival. But what this data suggests is that our social lives may be just as important for our overall risk for mortality as some of these other factors that not only do we take personally very seriously for our health, but are also the factors that are receive considerable amount of attention and resources in public health. So what are the effects beyond premature mortality? There's also a wealth of data that is consistent with the evidence that shows that isolation and loneliness influences a variety of non-fatal outcomes. So for instance, when it comes to our physical health, this has been linked to increased risk for heart attack and stroke, as well as type 2 diabetes. When it comes to mental and behavioral health, it's been linked to increased risk for depression and anxiety, suicidality and addiction. When it comes to cognitive health, this has been linked to mild cognitive impairment, dementia, and Alzheimer's disease. And it has also been linked to economic health. So for example, AARP study found that social isolation among older adults is associated with $6.7 billion in annual Medicare spending. And of course, the economic burden of loneliness is actually likely to be much larger, given that it has also been linked to greater workplace absenteeism, lower productivity, and lower quality of work. There's also a wide and growing body of evidence that has documented how these things occur, giving us important clues in terms of how it is that our relationships can ultimately lead to better or worse health outcomes, or even one's odds of survival. So for example, the distressing feelings of being isolated and lonely can heighten stress, triggering increases in heart rate and blood pressure, stress hormones, and inflammatory factors, which, if sustained over time, can put wear and tear on our body. For example, work by Steve Cole has illustrated how loneliness is linked to a state of threat that signals a sympathetic response, including the release of norepinephrine into the bone marrow, priming inflammatory responses. Chronic levels of inflammation have been linked to mental, cognitive, and physical health outcomes. And so these chronic illnesses, in turn, can influence our risk for earlier death. So I point this out because chronic inflammation may be one potential common pathway that would explain why we're seeing such diverse effects associated with being isolated or lonely or other forms of social disconnection. But I'm sure many of you are wondering, but what about the virus, right? And so while we have strong evidence of these chronic health effects and earlier mortality, is there any evidence to suggest that it influences susceptibility to viruses? There was actually a recent review that was published that summarizes 35 years of studies that identified factors associated with susceptibility to cold and flu viruses. And so many of these are viral challenge studies. And what this data shows is that, those who are experiencing interpersonal stressors, such as loneliness, had a greater chance of developing an upper respiratory illness when exposed to the virus. And further, those with greater social support were more likely to mount an effective immune response to a vaccine. So, of course, caution should be taken given that these were cold and flu viruses, but nonetheless, there are important implications. So taken together, what this suggests is that there are both short and long-term potential consequences And it suggests that this public health crisis that we have been facing may be compounded by the secondary health effects associated with isolation and loneliness. And yet, despite the strong evidence that of these health consequences, we still don't have a good sense of the precise timing of these consequences. I can't tell you how many reporters I've talked to that have basically asked, okay, so just how long can we endure this? At what point do we start seeing these things? And so this is an important question that the science still needs to understand in terms of how these things unfold over time, though we do see that these consequences do occur. There are also questions about who is at greatest risk. One comforting sentiment that throughout all of this has been the idea that we're all in the same boat. This sense of solidarity, that we're in this together, and somewhat of a comfort that we're not alone in this struggle. But unfortunately, this analogy is perhaps flawed. A better analogy might be that we are all facing the same storm, but in different boats. Some of us are in yachts, some of us are in rowboats, and some of us may be going solo in a kayak. We are not all equally equipped to weather this storm. And the pandemic has highlighted a number of inequalities, many of which have become magnified in this crisis. And so this pandemic provides an opportunity for us to better understand these inequalities and how we might better support others. And so what kinds of data do we have on those who might be most vulnerable, who might most be in need of that assistance? My colleagues and I, during the pandemic, conducted a multinational study, including data from 101 countries in 10 different languages. And what we found was that those who reported greater personal finance concerns, poor mental health, those who were living alone, and those who were of younger age, all consistently reported greater severity of loneliness and social isolation. And this was true both prior to the pandemic as well as during the pandemic. Now, this younger age might be somewhat surprising for many, since we often associate loneliness and isolation with older age. But surveys consistently suggest that the highest prevalence rates are actually among young adults. In fact, a recent study found that loneliness peaks at the age of 19. And one thing I want to note, however, is that loneliness wasn't absent at any age. So while it might have been higher among younger adults, no one seemed to be immune from it. So when it comes to public health, prioritization often relies heavily on the extent to which an issue is prevalent, urgent, and serious. And so clearly this issue meets those criteria and requires continued prioritization. And this should occur and is needed beyond the crisis of the pandemic. But what can we do? Despite the strong evidence of the health effects, the biggest challenge that we face is that there's less known about effective strategies to mitigate risk. And of course, during the pandemic, this challenge to reduce risk rose exponentially. Because if we go back to that analogy, if loneliness is a biological cue similar to thirst, it's as if we can't access what we crave most. It's as if we're all incredibly thirsty and being told that the water's not safe to drink. And so we were faced and have been faced with the challenge of how to satisfy this biological need without close proximity to others. And so during the pandemic, there's been increasing interest in remote kinds of solutions. Of course, this was tech-based solutions were of huge interest prior to the pandemic, but during the pandemic, the need for connecting socially remotely increased the access to these tools. But what do we actually know about the effectiveness of these tools in terms of keeping us socially connected and staving off loneliness? Importantly, the evidence that I've presented today on the protective effects of being socially connected is primarily based on data where people are connecting in person. Many of the longitudinal studies began prior to the widespread use of many of these digital and means of social connection, and we have less evidence in terms of the equivalencies. I have to note that this is an incredibly complex body of evidence, and so I don't want to oversimplify it in any way. But nonetheless, it does highlight the need for caution. For instance, some of these approaches have been shown either to not be effective in reducing isolation or loneliness or even distress. And in fact, some of the evidence that we collected showed that those who had greater dissatisfaction with these tools actually reported greater severity of loneliness. So caution is needed. We also need to recognize that there are barriers in terms of access. And so as these tools are being scaled broadly, it is clear that there needs to be more evidence in terms of what is effective. So unfortunately, tech-based solutions may not be the silver bullet solution, and human-centered approaches may still be needed. So I want to just highlight some evidence that we have around effectiveness. My colleagues and I recently published a meta-analysis of 106 randomized control trials that focused on supporting individuals in medical settings. And this included data from over 40,000 patients. Patients who are randomly assigned to receive some kind of psychosocial support were associated with a 20% increased likelihood of survival compared to patients who received standard medical treatment alone. And those that looked at length of survival, those who received psychosocial support had a 29% increased probability of survival compared to those that received just standard treatment alone. So I should mention that this was psychosocial treatment in addition to standard medical treatment. So what this evidence suggests is that providing support to patients can increase survival beyond just standard medical treatment. And when we benchmark this relative to other kinds of medical interventions, we found that these effects were comparable to many other kinds of interventions, including smoking cessation and lifestyle interventions. So in other words, what we were able to find is that not only does naturally occurring socially connected increase our lifespan, but actually providing support to others was also shown to increase survival. But one of the things that we need to recognize is that to have an effect on population health, we need to go beyond medical settings. Drawing on data from 4 nationally representative samples across the lifespan, evidence points to a dose-response effect, meaning that for every increase in social connection, there was a decrease in risk. And this was true across the life course. So what that suggests is that every one of us is somewhere on this continuum of risk. And yet our interventions, even if effective, are only targeting those on the extreme end of the spectrum, potentially missing a huge portion of the population. If we want to have a larger impact on population health, we need to consider approaches that, that target the entire population to potentially shift that risk trajectory. So how do we do that? When we think of what the kinds of things that we need to do to live a healthier life, we often think of exercise, diet, not smoking, exercise, sleep. We need to add social relationships to that list. So how do we do that? We take these things seriously because we have national guidelines that provide recommendations for what we should be striving for. These are what are taught in schools in public health education. It's what our doctors talk to us about in our routine visits. And it's what's emphasized in public health-facing campaigns. And so if we want to affect public health, we need to have similar scoping responses. So I'm proud to say that there are some approaches that are currently underway and that I and my colleagues have been working on. So I'm just going to highlight a few. So for example, there's long been a call for the inclusion of social isolation and loneliness in the electronic health record. I've been a subject matter expert on the Gravity Project, and this has just recently been approved and will be included in the electronic health record and the ICD-10 codes, soon to be ICD-11, and has been adopted by EPIC, as well as Medicare and Medicaid. There's also the Administration for Community Living, as well as the World Health Organization, that are establishing clearinghouses of effective interventions and evaluating those that are, and weighing those that are evidence-based, as well as establishing evidence gap maps for that. And some of these organizations are also working on public health campaigns that will be launched soon. So recently, my work has also examined some of the potential for public health policy. And the pandemic provides opportunity for us to carefully evaluate the public health consequences of this issue, as well as these strategies. One thing that I think has become abundantly clear during this pandemic is how pervasive social contact is as part of every aspect of our life. Because we have seen how by having to reduce social contact, it has impacted every single aspect of our lives. And so what this suggests is that every single sector of society may play a potential role in both risk and protection. And so if we think about the World Health Organization's Health in All Policy framework, which suggests that every sector of society can potentially influence health, that similarly, we can consider the social ramifications of every sector of society, including the health sector, transportation, housing, employment, nutrition, water, and sanitation. Given the disruptions we've seen across each of these sectors, we can see that social contact is clearly relevant to each of these sectors and can be considered in potential policies that address this and potentially as solutions. I also want to, I wanted to take this a step farther. And so my colleagues and I developed a framework to guide both national and international strategies. This integrates the socio-ecological framework that is widely adopted by the CDC, as well as the Health in All Policies framework. But this also goes farther by identifying cross-cutting themes. And so as you can see, the socio-ecological model is represented by acknowledging that the individual is contextualized within interpersonal relationships, organizations, institutions, the community, and society. And that this can be looked at across all of the sectors of the Health in All Policy model. But I want to point out these cross-cutting themes. And that is that across these, we need to consider this across the life course, as this is something that affects us from conception to death. We also need to consider diversity and equity to ensure that we minimize any kind of health disparities. And we also need to consider both evidence and application across all of these. And so we created this grid to begin to guide and systematically identify both gaps and opportunities as these intersect. So as you can see, across the top in the green are the levels of influence across the socioecological model, and in the blue, the sectors of society according to the health and all policy model. So if we can systematically tackle this by identifying opportunities and gaps, we can potentially accelerate this effort. One thing to note is that most of the evidence and application is only occurring within one of these intersections, and that is the health sector at the individual level. What this suggests is that there are so many untapped opportunities, and by systematically identifying these, we can accelerate that progress. So I want to conclude by also recognizing that there are small things that we can do. We don't need to just look at the big picture. We can also do small and simple things. So I want to share with you a study that I did over the pandemic in which we tested whether some of these small things could make big change. In partnership with the app Nextdoor, my colleagues and I conducted an international randomized control trial, which included nearly 4,500 people from Australia, UK, and the United States. And participants were randomly assigned to the KIND challenge, or a waitlist control. And so those who were assigned to the KIND challenge were asked to simply perform small acts of kindness for their neighbors once a week for 4 weeks. These small acts of kindness were based on social support theory and research, and here are just some examples of things that people could choose to do. For instance, having regular contact with a neighbor, showing care and concern, helping a neighbor out, etc. So what did we find? Overall, the KIND challenge was found to be effective on our primary outcome. It resulted in significant reductions in loneliness and isolation, reductions in social anxiety, improvements in neighborhood quality, as well as reductions in conflict. It also increased the number of people who reported knowing at least 6 neighbors per day, which was also found to be associated with lower loneliness. So what are the broader implications? This is pretty remarkable given that it was done during the pandemic. We thought perhaps everyone might be increasing in loneliness, and maybe if this was effective, we'd only see smaller reductions in loneliness as a result of this intervention. So the fact that we were able to see reductions in loneliness was quite remarkable. But it was also remarkable because this is an intervention that doesn't require any kind of staff or specialized training or resources. Literally anyone can do it. It was also remarkable because we found these effects on the person who was providing the acts of kindness. Presumably, the person on the receiving end also benefited. And so there may have been unmeasured additional benefits that occurred as a result of this. So I just want to conclude by making a shameless plug for you all to take the KIND challenge. This doesn't necessarily need to be done through any kind of app or your neighborhood. All I ask is that you take a moment to do something kind for someone else. And our evidence suggests that one of the best ways that you can help yourself is to help others. So let's make kindness contagious. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. We care in the college, we care a great deal about physical and mental health and belonging. And so as the dean, my mind is just spinning about things that we can do in the college to help and also our neighborhoods and beyond. So I would like to honor Dr. Holt-Lunstad for receiving this prestigious award. So we have a plaque for her. I'm going to come back up here now that you're comfortable. And just, if you could join me in thanking her one more time for, Thank you so much. That was just excellent. I'm also very pleased to announce our Hickman Scholar for 2022-23 will be Dr. Matt Becker. You want to stand up for a second, Matt? So over here, he's from our Department of Geography, and we're really excited to hear about his excellent research next year. Thank you again all for joining us, and thank you so much for Dr. Holt-Lunstad for sharing her expertise with us.